Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome on this ghastly evening. You're very brave to come out, and perhaps those remaining at home are quite sensible today. The tale of three grandmothers, Bozena Nemcova in her time and ours. Before we actually start with the program, I need to thank the Czech Republic Embassy for hosting this event. And I need to tell you also that this event is being recorded, and any donations to the BCSA are for educational purposes in the Czech Republic. Apologies again, but I now have the very great pleasure of introducing Susan Reynolds, who many of you will know. She's speaking this evening on A Tale of Three Grandmothers, Bozena Nemcova in her time and ours. And I would like to give a special welcome to Mike Tate, founder of the Jantar Publishing company, which is producing this book. Thank you. Susan Reynolds was appointed as curator of Czech and Slovak sections at the British Library in 2004, and now works in its Department of Research Services. She has lectured and published on Czech cultural links with France and Germany, and her publications include translations of Karel Jaromir Erben's Kytice, the Adorno-Kracauer correspondence, and a chapter in Racine's roman Tragedies. There will be an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. So it's my pleasure to invite you now to speak about Babicka. Thank you.
It is a very great honour to be here this evening, and I thank you all especially for having ventured out in such terrible weather. And yet, when I was travelling up here myself under certain difficulties, I was reflecting on what we can learn from this novel and how we can apply it to contemporary life. Back in 2015, two authors, Ella Bertel and Susan Elderkin, brought out a book called The Novel Cure. It had its origins in their experiences as students of English literature at Cambridge. When either of them was undergoing any kind of crisis, her friend would offer her a novel which she thought would give her some wise counsel and some answers about how to deal with it. Babicka, I'm sorry to say, is not one of the novels included. And yet, by the end of this evening, I hope you will agree with me that it certainly should be, and why it should be. It's an honour and also quite a formidable task to translate this novel. It is one of the great treasures of Czech 19th century literature, and it is also one of the most popular which is still read nowadays. Attempting such an enormous task as speaking about why and how I came to translate it, why it is such an important text, and what it means for our times, is something which I can only break down into several sections. So first of all, for those who don't perhaps know too much about the author's life, I will tell you something of Bozena Nemcova and the strictures and difficulties which she faced in composing this novel. Then I will look at the two previous translations. Why, when they exist, do we need a third? Well, the answer is perhaps that one of them was written in the late 19th century, the second in the mid-20th, and so perhaps in the 21st it is time for a reappraisal and a new translation. And then perhaps you'd like to hear a short extract from this latest translation, so you can judge yourselves whether it is worth reading, which I hope you will. And then I will wind up with a rather personal note about the background to this translation and what I learned and discovered while I was making it. So, to begin at the beginning. Bozena Nemcova is said to have been born on the 4th of February 1820. This is generally accepted as the date of her birth because the baptismal register in the church in Vienna's Alsterstrasse, where she was christened, gives her date of birth as indeed February the 4th. She was christened Barbara, the Viennese form of her name, because her godmother was a lady called Barbara Haupt, who was the mistress of the inn where her mother, Theresia, was working as a maidservant. The register also records that this little Barbara was illegitimate. Some months later, in August of that year, her mother married a man by the name of Josef Pankow, and he was put down on the register as Barbara's father. But her precise origins have been questioned. Some of you may have read a book by Bozena Nemcova in which she investigates the mystery of Bozena Nemcova, which indeed is the title of the book. One of the theories, perhaps the most modest, is that she was actually born a few years earlier. The reason for this is that when she started school in Česká Kalice some years later, she was said to have started school in 1824. Now, this might indicate that she was a rather precocious student, and it has been hazarded guess that possibly she was born slightly earlier, and that the child whose register, that was 1820, was actually a subsequent one. However, it's not totally unlikely, for reasons I will explain later, that she did indeed start school at an early age. But much more colourful is one story which suggests that she was of noble birth, that she was actually the illegitimate child of Wilhelmina, the Duchess of Sagan, or possibly, according to another theory, of her younger sister Dorothea. Be that as it may, she lived as the child of her parents as recorded, the Pankows, on the estate where her father acted as a kind of steward. And because his duties involved travelling with his employers to Vienna during the winter, and her mother, who had originally been a laundress, went with him, the children's maternal grandmother, Magdalena Novotna, came to take charge of the household and look after them. The relationship between this grandmother and her eldest granddaughter was a very close and affectionate one. The family was a large one. In the end, it numbered 12 children, but sadly, most of these did not survive. But it might even be suggested that Magdalena was more of a mother figure to her grandchildren than their own mother. In her memoirs, Bozena Nemcova records that her mother was a rather chilly and austere person with little to say to her children. And when she punished them, the children were actually expected to thank her for doing so. On the other hand, her father appears to be a warm and affectionate man, and the little Barbara was very fond of him. She went to school in the village, and at the age of 10, she left it. But this was not the end of her education, because she was sent to a local manor to learn such arts as embroidery, music, literature, and all the accomplishments to equip her for a more genteel life. In fact, she was no longer Barbara or Barbora, to use the Czech spelling, but Fräulein Betty. Her mother clearly had ambitions for her. Or, more pragmatically, she was determined to avoid her daughter suffering a similar fate to her own. At that time, it was common for Bohemian girls of peasant birth to go off into service in Vienna. Many of them were naive and gullible and easy prey for their employers. And so, at the age of 17, a marriage was arranged for Barbara to a customs official. He was 15 years older than she was, and again she records in her memoirs that when she went to her marriage with Josef Nemetz, she was tear-stained and apprehensive, as she might well have been. From the outset, the marriage was not a happy one. Over the following years, Josef was transferred from one post to another. He was a fervent Czech patriot, which did his career no favours. They went on to have 4 children, 3 boys, Hinek, Karel and Jaromir, and finally a daughter by the name of Theodora. So the family moved from place to place as he was transferred from one position to another. Most of these were in fairly humble areas where literary and cultural circles were limited.